Picky for the Kaka. This is a podcast I put out with an email newsletter, also called The Kaka, all about Aotearoa's political economy around housing, climate, and poverty. Today, I wanted to look at Labour leader Chris Hipkins's State of the Nation address yesterday, given that I covered the State of the Nation address for Christopher Luxon, the Prime Minister. It gives it an early indication of what Christopher Luxon will be campaigning on as Labour leader, his ambitions for significant new policy change, and his view of how politics and government works in Aotearoa. Have a look through the full speech, which I've linked to in the email newsletter, and some of the reports, particularly Tim Murphy's from Newsroom, which includes a lot of the quotes from Hipkins's comments in the Q&A with Simon Bridges, the Chamber of Commerce's CEO, which was the venue for the speech. The speech is really focused on Chris Hipkins downplaying expectations for significant policy change in the first 3 years of any Labor government that's elected and at the election in 9 months. He says that politicians over time have promised too much and delivered too little. He's more interested in over-delivering and under-promising. And he says that he's going to be careful about not promising to massively improve people's lives in the first 3 years, even though Labor is saying it will focus totally on affordability in its election campaigns. Now, it's hard to make judgments about what the final policies will be for Labor until it comes out with its budget plan after the May 28th budget. And there we'll get some indications of the key thing for Labor, and in many ways the direction of the government overall. And that is the 30-30 rule, which regular listeners will recognise. This is the essentially bipartisan view about the size of government and the size of government debt, which has been in place for 25 years. Essentially, it's the post-Rogernomics, post-Ruthanasia settlement, in which both major parties have agreed to Treasury's prescription, arbitrary in my view, that the size of government should be no more than 30% of GDP. That's the so-called safe and sensible and good level of government. And that effectively means no new taxes and constant downward pressure on growth in public services, and also public debt being around 30 to 40% of GDP as the so-called safe level to have a so-called buffer in the event of a rainy day. Trouble, of course, is that New Zealand is regularly having rainy days. You could argue it's having a permanent rainy day because of underinvestment and it's the results of this constant drive towards 30-30. Now, Chris Hipkins is essentially, in my view, been quite frank here about admitting that politicians can't do much, or at least they believe they can't do much because they are so constrained by political forces representing the status quo, the vested interests, which always campaign hard against policy change, and also the international agreements and the global financial market pressures, which the two main parties believe cannot be breached. This is the idea that if New Zealand's government has too much debt, that it will be punished by the world's bond vigilantes and New Zealand will lose access to financial markets, interest rates will explode, and the economy will be wrecked. That, in my view, is a hangover from the situation in the late 80s, early 90s, when New Zealand did have much higher foreign debt and its interest costs were significantly higher. Now, New Zealand's interest costs, net interest costs, the government's net interest costs are barely 1.5% of total income. And this fear of the bond vigilantes is totally out of date, out of place, and just at odds with what we see in front of our eyes in global financial markets, which is that New Zealand is currently borrowing $450 million a week, but the bids from bond fund managers, and we're talking almost half of them from New Zealand, are regularly 4 to 5 times that. So there's no problem selling those bonds. And one of the inevitable results of widening inequality is that as the rich get richer, A, they can't spend all their money and are very reluctant to take risks to invest it. And so inevitably look to put it into what they see as safe assets, which they always see as government bonds and treasury bills. It's the reason why, despite all of the talk of unsustainable debt, as long as there are buyers for those bonds, and there almost always are, then you don't have this threat or this danger that is often talked about with public debt. Now, you could argue in a freely available world of freely moving capital, that New Zealand, because of its relatively small size, will always have to work harder to get the attention and the interest of bond fund managers, whereas the United States or Japan, for example, have a huge natural demand for those bonds. Well, there is natural demand for those bonds, ironically, from the New Zealand Super Fund and ACC, apart from anything else, and KiwiSaver funds. And remember, these are bonds issued in New Zealand dollars at fixed interest rates, and where the currency and interest rate risk is taken by the lender, not by the borrower, which was the case in the late 80s and early 90s, when Treasury's views about 30/30 were set in stone. So we'll find out from Chris Hipkins and Labor after the budget whether it's going to repeat its adherence to the 30/30 rule. If it does, and reading between the lines of this speech, it looks like they will, then nothing much changes. And we are stuck in a captured democracy with a stagnant set of political forces and 200 people a day leaving the country because they believe it doesn't work for them. I'm Bernard Hickey. That was a chorus for Tuesday, February the 24th. Ka kite anō.